Something extraordinary is happening inside the White House right now, and it's not happening behind closed doors. It's happening in plain sight, in front of cameras, in front of the world, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. In the past 30 days alone, Vice President J.D. Vance has been dispatched to Budapest to campaign alongside Viktor Orban, a man whose poll numbers collapsed almost immediately after Vance appeared on that stage. He was then sent to Islamabad, Pakistan, to negotiate a ceasefire with Iran, talks that intelligence officials privately admitted were designed to fail before they even began. And while Vance was sitting across the table from Iranian intermediaries in a foreign capital, thousands of miles from Washington, President Donald Trump was courtside at a UFC fight, with Marco Rubio beside him, grinning for the cameras. Let that image settle for a moment. The Vice President of the United States, negotiating what the White House itself called one of the most consequential diplomatic missions of the year. And the President chose that exact night to be photographed with his Secretary of State at a sporting event, projecting ease, power, and, most pointedly, companionship with someone else. This is not a scheduling coincidence. This is not optics mismanagement. Political analysts, former White House staffers, and people who have studied Donald Trump's behavior for over a decade are now using a specific term to describe what is unfolding: humiliation ritual. The concept is straightforward but devastating in its implications. When a dominant political figure systematically assigns their closest ally a series of impossible tasks, public failures, and degrading optics, not to test them, but to break them, that is a humiliation ritual. And by every measurable indicator, J.D. Vance is currently living through one in real time. His approval rating has reached the lowest ever recorded for a sitting vice president at this stage of an administration. His foreign missions have produced 0 wins, and the man who sent him on every single one of those missions has spent that same period distancing himself, elevating rivals, and, most shockingly, posting an image of himself depicted as Jesus Christ on social media. What is really happening inside this White House? And what does it mean for the country when the second most powerful man in America is being publicly diminished by the first? Stay with us. The full picture is darker than the headlines suggest. To understand what is happening to J.D. Vance right now, you have to go back to the beginning, not 2024, not even 2020. You have to go back to 2016, when a then unknown author from Appalachian, Ohio, wrote a memoir about poverty, dysfunction, and the forgotten white working class, and overnight became the most talked about political voice in America. J.D. Vance did not arrive in Donald Trump's orbit as a loyalist. He arrived as a critic. In private messages leaked years later, Vance called Trump, in his own words, America's Hitler. He wondered openly whether Trump would destroy the country. He was, by every measure, a never-Trumper. Intellectual, Yale-educated, backed by Silicon Valley money, and deeply skeptical of the populist wave cresting around him. Then, something shifted. Between 2020 and 2022, Vance executed one of the most dramatic political reversals in modern American history. He embraced Trump fully, publicly, and without apparent reservation. Trump endorsed him for the Ohio Senate race in 2022. Vance won, and by 2024, he had been selected as Trump's running mate, the heir apparent to the MAGA movement, positioned one heartbeat away from the presidency. On the surface, it looked like a partnership. In practice, it was always a transaction. Those who know how Donald Trump operates, and there are many who have written about it in granular detail, will tell you that Trump does not have partners. He has instruments. People who are useful get elevated. People who show independence get punished. And people who dare to suggest, even gently, that Trump might be making a mistake get destroyed. That turning point came during closed-door discussions at the highest levels of the Trump administration regarding a potential military strike on Iran. According to detailed reporting by the New York Times, sourced from individuals present in the room, J.D. Vance was the sole voice of skepticism among senior officials. He told the president directly, "This is not a good idea." He did not refuse. He did not resign. He said he would support whatever Trump decided, but he said those 7 words, "I don't think this is a good idea." And in the court of Donald Trump, that is not caution. That is betrayal. From that moment forward, the assignments Vance received changed in character. They stopped being opportunities. They started being traps. The pattern that followed was not random. It was sequential, escalating, and, to those watching closely, unmistakably deliberate. Let us walk through the assignments one by one. Because when you line them up in sequence, the architecture of what is happening becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Assignment 1. Hungary. Vance was dispatched to Budapest to appear alongside Viktor Orban, the Hungarian strongman who has become a symbol of European illiberalism and a darling of the MAGA right. On the surface, it appeared to be an ideological alignment, two populist governments signaling solidarity. But the timing was critical. Orban was heading into a bruising electoral period. His numbers were already soft. And the moment Vance stepped onto that stage, Orban's poll numbers dropped further. The image that circulated globally was not one of strength. It was one of the American vice president lending legitimacy to a struggling authoritarian and getting nothing in return. Washington insiders noted privately that anyone with a basic briefing on Hungarian domestic politics would have flagged the visit as a liability. Vance went anyway, because he was told to. Assignment 2. Pakistan. This one was more serious and more damaging. With the Iran conflict demanding urgent diplomatic engagement, Vance was sent to Islamabad to conduct face-to-face negotiations with Iranian intermediaries. The stated goal was a ceasefire framework, but according to sources familiar with the mission's internal planning, the parameters given to Vance were so narrow and the red lines so rigid that a successful outcome was structurally impossible before he boarded the plane. He sat across the table from representatives of a government that the United States had just been bombing. He carried a brief that gave him no real room to maneuver. And when the talks collapsed, as they were always going to, the narrative was already written. Vance had failed. The vice president could not close the deal. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Trump attended a UFC event with Marco Rubio. The photographs were everywhere within hours. Two men, relaxed, powerful, enjoying the spectacle. The contrast with Vance sweating through failed negotiations in Islamabad was not subtle. It was not meant to be. Assignment 3. The Pope. This one operates on a different level entirely because it is not geopolitical. It is personal, religious, and in many ways the most revealing move of all. Vance recently published a book about his conversion to Catholicism, a deeply personal account of how his faith became central to his identity and his values. The book was widely interpreted as the opening chapter of a future presidential campaign narrative. Pope Leo, the first American pope, has been outspoken in his moral critiques of certain Trump administration policies. Trump responded with public attacks on the Pope, attacks that placed Vance in an impossible position. Defend his faith and his Pope, or prostrate himself before Trump. He chose Trump. He had no real alternative. But the humiliation in that choice was total. A man who just published a book about the centrality of his Catholic faith was forced, publicly, to side against the leader of his own church because the President of the United States demanded it. Each assignment, each failure, each impossible choice, they are not accidents. They are a message, delivered loudly, publicly, and without mercy. Why does any of this matter beyond West Wing gossip? Why should the systematic humiliation of a vice president concern ordinary Americans who are worried about grocery prices, mortgage rates, and whether their children will inherit a stable world? The answer is this. What happens to J.D. Vance is not a sideshow. It is a direct window into how power is actually being exercised inside the most consequential government on earth, and what it reveals is deeply unsettling. First, consider the institutional implications. The Vice President of the United States is not merely a political figure. He is a constitutional officer. He is the President of the Senate. He is first in the line of succession. When the Vice President is being systematically undermined, publicly embarrassed, and stripped of credibility on the world stage, that is not just personal drama. That is an erosion of institutional authority that reverberates through every government and foreign ministry that watches Washington for signals of stability and coherence. Foreign leaders notice. When Vance arrived in Islamabad, diplomatic sources reported that his Iranian counterparts had already been briefed on his diminished standing within the administration. They knew before he sat down that he did not speak with the full authority of the president. That knowledge shaped every exchange. It shaped the outcome. A vice president who has been publicly weakened cannot project the kind of authority that serious negotiations require. Trump did not just set Vance up to fail. He ensured the failure by making it globally known that Vance was not fully backed. Second, consider what this reveals about decision-making architecture inside the White House. If the one senior official who raised skepticism about the Iran conflict was subsequently punished, sidelined, and publicly diminished, what does that tell us about the quality of counsel Trump is now receiving? Who in that room will speak honestly the next time a consequential decision is on the table? The answer, almost certainly, is no one. Because everyone has watched what happened to Vance and drawn the obvious conclusion. Silence is survival. Agreement is currency. Dissent is career death. This is how catastrophic decisions get made. Not through malice alone, but through the elimination of every internal check that might slow a bad idea down. Third, and perhaps most importantly, consider the signal being sent to the American public about the nature of loyalty in this administration. Vance gave everything. He reversed a decade of stated convictions. He defended policies he once opposed. He abandoned positions he once held with apparent sincerity. He delivered Ohio. He delivered a demographic. He delivered a brand. And in return, he is being walked through a public degradation that is visible to every voter, every ally, and every adversary paying attention. The strategic message Trump is sending is not complicated. It is ancient. It is the message that every court, every empire, and every authoritarian structure has sent to those who orbit power throughout human history. No one is safe. No loyalty is sufficient. No service is enough. And when that is the operating principle at the center of American executive power, the consequences extend far beyond one man's approval ratings. Pull back from the personalities. Pull back from the West Wing maneuvering and the UFC photographs and the papal controversy. Pull all the way back and look at the full picture. Because the consequences of what is unfolding inside this administration are not contained within Washington's borders. They are radiating outward, and ordinary people on every continent are already beginning to feel them. Start with the economy. The Iran conflict, which Vance privately opposed and was then forced to publicly champion, has introduced a level of instability into global energy markets that economists are describing with language they rarely deploy outside of genuine crisis. Oil supply routes through the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes every single day, are operating under threat conditions not seen in years. Analysts at major financial institutions have begun modeling scenarios in which sustained disruption to those routes pushes crude prices to levels that would translate directly into gasoline prices that American families have not seen since the worst inflationary periods of recent memory. Heating bills, transportation costs, the price of every good that moves on a truck, all of it connected to a conflict that the second most senior official in the United States government said, in a closed room, was not a good idea. He was right, and he was punished for it, and now the rest of the world is absorbing the cost. Beyond energy, look at the alliance architecture that American foreign policy has spent 80 years constructing. NATO partners are watching the Vance situation with a specific kind of dread. Not because they are particularly invested in his political future, but because of what his treatment signals about American reliability. If a vice president can be dispatched on a diplomatic mission with a sabotaged brief used as a scapegoat for a predetermined failure and publicly humiliated while the president attends a sporting event, what does that tell allied governments about the value of American commitments? What does it tell them about whether Washington's word on any agreement, on any treaty, on any security guarantee can be taken seriously? The answer coming back from European capitals, from Asian foreign ministries, from Gulf state advisors, is quietly alarming. Trust in American institutional consistency, already damaged across the previous years of political turbulence, is eroding further. And trust, once lost at the level of sovereign relationships, takes generations to rebuild. Then there is the domestic dimension that connects most directly to the viewer watching this right now. The pattern being normalized inside this White House, where honesty is punished, where dissent is career-ending, where one man's need for absolute loyalty overrides every institutional safeguard. That pattern does not stay inside the White House. It filters down, it shapes appointments, it shapes regulatory decisions, It shapes who gets heard and who gets silenced across the entire apparatus of the federal government. And what of J.D. Vance himself? Those who have studied Trump's political behavior most closely are nearly unanimous in their assessment. The humiliation cycle Vance is currently enduring does not end with rehabilitation. It ends with replacement. The UFC photographs with Rubio were not casual. The dispatching of Vance to missions designed to fail was not temporary. Trump is, by every behavioral indicator, doing to his vice president precisely what he has done to others before him, building a public record of failure and incompetence that will justify, when the moment comes, a clean and well-documented break. Whether that break comes through a 2028 endorsement of someone else, a behind-the-scenes push to sideline Vance from the ticket entirely, or simply the slow suffocation of his political brand through accumulated humiliation, the trajectory is clear to anyone willing to look at it honestly. J.D. Vance is not the story. He is the symptom. The story is a system of power that has eliminated internal checks, exported its failures onto scapegoats, destabilized critical diplomatic relationships, and is now generating economic consequences felt by families thousands of miles from the rooms where these decisions are made. The question that remains, and it is the most important question of all, is whether the institutions designed to absorb and correct these pressures are still strong enough to do so. Whether the Senate, the courts, the press, the allied relationships, and ultimately the American voter retain enough independent authority to redirect what is happening before the costs become irreversible. History is watching, and history, as Rachel Maddow has reminded us more than once, does not grade on a curve. If this analysis matters to you, if you believe that scrutiny of power is not optional but essential, then subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell, because this story is not over, not even close, and when the next development breaks, you need to be here.